Morning, everybody. Welcome to our first clinic on biodiversity net gain. My name is Richard Lancashire, and I'm the Programme Director at the Future Homes Hub. So these biodiversity net gain clinics, well, they came about as we've really seen a real disparity in knowledge and preparedness for biodiversity net gain. But it's really important that all those involved in house building really understand what they need to do to successfully improve in biodiversity. So whilst we're at the Hub, we publish guidance and other supporting documents, and obviously have a look at our website to see what they are. We continue to work with government and other key stakeholders to identify priority issues and how we'll tackle them. But we've seen that these sort of Q&A sessions really help to tease out what are the real problems that people are experiencing them, and they're obviously a good way of disseminating information as well. So we're very lucky today to have three leading lights in biodiversity who are here to field your questions. So we've got Neil Beamsley, Head of Biodiversity at one of the UK's leading home builders, Bellway. And in fact, Neil's our one ecologist on the panel. We've got Nick White, who's Principal Advisor at Natural England, and he's leading Natural England's work on developing and securing net gain outcomes from developments. And Penny Simpson. Penny is a partner and environmental law lead at Freeths, and Penny's got a particular expertise in natural environment law. So our topic today is about the BNG metric, and we'll try to keep to that topic, please. Obviously, the biodiversity net gain is a large and sort of broad subject, but if we can keep to discussions around the BNG metric. And also, this session is really intended for practical advice and aimed at SME developers primarily. It's not an ecologist training session. So if you're a developer, please think what you need to know about the BNG metric. We'll begin with Neil, who's going to give us a short presentation shortly on the metric, and then we'll open to the rest of the panel to your questions. So please type them into the Q&A function rather than the chat function. Type in your questions in the Q&A function, and we'll see if we can answer as many as we can. With over 100 people, I think, signed up. I haven't seen how many people actually attended, but we had over 100 signed up. So we're unlikely to get through all of your questions. And in fact, given the intended audience, we'll probably skip over the more technical queries as well. But all of your questions are useful, even if we don't get to answer them, because what we'll do, we'll take them, we'll analyze them to see where there's a lack of understanding, and then we'll work with our other partners to determine how we or others can actually help to plug that gap. So two final points just before I hand over. You may note that this session is being recorded. So what we'll do, we'll take this, might do a few minor edits, but then we'll publish this on our website shortly after. And the other point that Nick's asked me to mention is about the fact that Natural England do have a dedicated help email for those questions about the metric that can't be answered by the published guidance. And the email is biodiversitymetric@naturalengland.org.uk. We'll stick that email address in the chat. But again, just for those particular technical queries that can't be answered by the guidance, but there is that option to send into that email there. Right, so that's enough for me. Neil, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. Just share my screen a second. Just confirm that's appeared for everyone.
Yes, it is.
Great, thank you. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Neil. I'm from Bellway Homes. I'm Head of Biodiversity, and today I'm just going to go through a little bit of an introductory session with you in terms of the nuts and bolts of biodiversity net gain, where it's come from, how the metric works, and a few things for people to consider as they're planning their developments going forward in a biodiversity net gain world. So first and foremost, I think most of you will be familiar with this, but it's always useful just to refer back to the original definition of what BNG is. So BNG is an approach to development and land management which aims to leave the natural world in a measurably better state. The key word really from most of us there is measure, because it's a very different, in very crude terms, you have a situation whereby you have a natural environment that is developed, and therefore you generally result in a net loss. If you have a natural environment that's developed with a bit of mitigation, then you can probably get towards no net loss, but no net gain. But if you have development with mitigation and specific mitigation measures, you can get towards a net gain. And that very crudely is what we're talking about in terms of biodiversity net gain overall. So when does BNG apply? Well, when it goes live for the main metro, or the main, it's not small sites, but the main BNG thrust comes live in November. And that will apply to any planning permission with a few quite minor exemptions. So we don't know for sure what they'll be at this stage. DEFRA is still to confirm that, but from the consultation response we had back in February, we think it's going to be anything with a sort of de minimis threshold of less than 25 square meters or 5 linear meters for hedgerows. Householder applications, so things like 2-story extensions, will be exempt. Small scale self-builds and custom builds, and sites that are being used for the purposes of biodiversity net gain. It should be noted, and it's really, really important, particularly for the SME developers among you, that it will include previously developed land. Sorry, there's an interference. Can everyone just make sure their mics are turned off?
Yes, I did.
Thank you. Yes, so it does apply to previously developed land, often referred to as sometimes open mosaic type habitats or brownfield sites. It will include change of use, and it will include temporary applications, although there are allowances within the metric for temporary applications. All of those types of applications will be captured by the BNG requirement. And critically, it's really important to remember that BNG comes from statutes, and as a result of that, it sits at the very top of the planning balance tree. So viability, we can't afford it, is not really going to be reasonable grounds for appeal. It is going to have to be delivered. There may be grounds for appeal if a local policy requires 20, and you may be able to argue that down to 10, but that base 10% requirement will stand regardless. So one to make sure that you're fully aware with and comfortable with in terms of how that might affect your development going forwards. Another key thing just for everyone to be aware of is the anti-trash date. So this is a part of the legislation, it's built into the statutes. It means that if a local authority takes the view that a site has been artificially cleared or deliberately cleared to artificially reduce the BNG baseline, they can insist that the BNG assessment is based on the habitats present on the 30th of January 2020. The reason it's that date is because that's the first date that the Act came before Parliament, before it became law. But basically they can draw you back to that date, and that's the date upon which your assessment must be made. So it's really important to think clearly and carefully about any land management, any site clearance, any site investigation work, and what effect that could have on the BNG baseline. In terms of the metric, it is essentially an ability to measure biodiversity loss or gain. That's what the metric gives us, which is different to what we've had previously. Previously, it's very much been a case of an ecological consultant putting together a proportionate and reasonable argument. That goes to the local authority and they make their assessment based upon that. Now what we have is a situation where we have a level playing field, everyone's using the same tool, and that tool is what dictates the level of gain or loss. It's a standardized metric, so we're probably all aware that there are various different iterations. The Warwickshire calculator is probably the most famous one, but lots and lots of other universities, public utilities have developed their own version. They will all be superseded by the single DEFRA statutory metric come November. There are two types. There's the small sites metric, which is currently on version 4, and the main metric. Metric 4 was published in March and followed about a decade's worth of development and iteration going through the process from the pilot through version 2, 3, 3.1, and now version 4. For now, older versions of the metric can still be used and they are still acceptable in terms of planning. But once we hit November and we go into BNG as a requirement, then it's probably going to be the case that everyone will have to just revert to the statutory metric to make sure the local authorities are happy with what's being provided. So there's a little bit of a grace period as we are at the moment, but beyond November, everyone needs to use the statutory metrics. The small sites metric is primarily for small sites, as the name suggests, so that the parameters of that are fewer than 10 residential units, no more than 9, or less than 1 hectare. Or if the number of residential units is not known, it's a site of less than 0.5 of a hectare. For non-residential, where the floor space created is less than 1,000 square meters, I think that should be, or where the site itself is less than 1 hectare. However, it's really important to remember that there are limitations with the small sites metric. So if you've got particularly valuable habitats on your site, you can't, or irreplaceable habitats, you can't use the metric, or priority habitats. If you've got European protected species that are a constraint on the site, you can't use the small sites metric. And critically, the small sites metric does not allow you to go off site to define your 10%. So if you can't deliver 10% within your red line boundary, you have to use the main metric to do your assessment. The main metric, I'll look at Nick for this one, but I'm not sure if that's the exact term, but essentially I'm talking about the main non-small sites metric that most people will be using and most people be familiar with. It can be used on any site. And that will be the metric that's attached to the changes to the Town and Country Planning Act, which will bring about the requirement to deliver BNG in the standard condition that will come alongside any planning application. It will be laid before Parliament at the end of October, early November time, and from that time, once it gets the parliamentary order, it will go forward into law, and that will be what everyone has to deliver to get their planning. So what does the metric do? Well, the first thing to bear in mind that the metric approach uses habitat only. So habitat is seen as a proxy for biodiversity. As we are at present, there is no species element to what we're doing. So although species will benefit from the improvements to habitats, providing provisions for species does not give you any points, essentially, in terms of the metric approach. It's an area and habitat based approach. So basically the area of habitat you have and the value of the habitat are the base settings for the way in which the metric works. It essentially assigns a numerical value, which is expressed as biodiversity units. And the starting point is the area. How much of a habitat do you have? What's the quality of the habitat? And then it applies a number of multipliers for each habitat parcel that you've entered into the metric. At the end of that process, you're given a biodiversity unit score, and the cumulative score for all of those habitat parcels is what gives you your baseline score for the site. The multipliers within the metric are all pre-formatted by DEFRA. So you tell the metric the condition, the age, how long it'll get to, where it is geographically and things like that. And that assigns a multiplier of 2, 4, and 6. And as that goes forwards, that's how you accumulate your score going through the process. Yeah, so the multipliers essentially escalate the score until you get to your habitat score for the site. It's worth pointing out that in terms of the 10% required, that's 10% for area or habitats, it's 10% for linear, i.e. hedgerows, and it's also 10% for rivers. I'm hearing quite a lot of people at the moment saying that you can kind of offset one with the other. That's not the case. Your 10% is for all of those 3 parameters within the BNG process. The process within the metric is completed for the baseline. So in other words, what is there now? So as you're going out, if your ecologists are going out doing their survey work, what will they find as they find it today? And then there's a post-intervention side of the metric, which is essentially what will be there at the end of the 30 years. So BNG is for 30 years as a minimum. You then compare the difference between what we have now and what we'll have at the end of the projected, what we'll have at the end of the 30 years. And the difference is your BNG score. So if it's a positive difference to 10%, that's great, you're compliant. If it's less than a positive 10% difference, then you're not compliant. You need to find a way of doing that additional couple of percent. As I say, the legislation requires a minimum of 10%, but some local authorities are already applying a 20% requirement from their local policy point of view. As I mentioned before, it might be possible that you can argue them down from 20, but you'll still always need to deliver your 10%. And it's also really important to remember that 10% is a minimum. And if you get to a situation whereby you're not delivering your 10%, you're only delivering 7%, well, then you're not compliant with the legislation. So it may be advantageous to over-deliver on your metric to give you a little bit of wriggle room that if some habitats fail, if we have a particularly dry summer, if we have climate change becoming a factor, then you've got that little bit of wriggle room within your assessment to give you to make sure you're still delivering that 10% overall. There are some key rules in the metric in terms of how things need to be accounted for. I'll not go through all of these because we're a little bit tight on time. You can find this in the guidance that goes with the metric that's on the DEFRA website, but there are key things in here. So for example, if you're using a metric assessment, different elements of the assessment, you have to use one consistently. You can't trade down. So if you're losing a habitat of medium distinctiveness, for example, you have to provide another habitat of medium distinctiveness or better. So the trajectory always has to be up instead of down in terms of the habitats you create. And also worth bearing in mind that there is a situation whereby The metric is an average. It's derived from averages. The UK Hab comes from kind of the best examples of that habitat type. So there's always going to be situations where some sites in a small number of occasions don't meet this process. In that situation, there is still a mechanism. Hope is not lost, but it is an exception to the rule that sometimes you might have to get your consultant ecologist to have a discussion with the local authority ecologist and perhaps find a bit more of a bespoke solution. The metric is a tool. It's not an absolute binding, but it is the thing that people should be using as a matter of course going through the planning process. And finally, just a few points to consider. As I say, it is a tool and it's something that everyone should be using in a positive light. Just because you put things into the metric doesn't mean you can't change them. It doesn't mean that you can't use the metric to help you evolve your scheme. And that's absolutely the way that BNG should be within planning. It should be an iterative process, a process that evolves and ultimately finds the best solution for biodiversity, but equally from a commercial point of view, finds a solution that's deliverable from you as developers. So it is a tool, make sure we use it as such in that way. There is scope and it's not an absolute fixed entity, but the expectation from local authorities will be that you do use the metric, you do deliver 10%, you do go through the usual process. So it comes down to your consultants being switched on, making sure that they're aware of the process, how the process works. If there's a need to have a conversation with a local authority, that is still there. And that's also still a really important part of being a consultant and helping clients to deliver their developments. Generally speaking, I would strongly advise that this is done at an early stage, because if you try and retrofit it, it can be very, very challenging. It's better to have your BNG up front and almost build the development around it now, rather than previously where it's an afterthought and then added at the end of the process. In terms of who can complete the metric, for the small sites metric, it can be anyone. For the main metric, it has to be someone who's referred to as a suitably qualified person. There are some useful definitions around, although not a single definition as to what a suitably qualified person would be. BS4 2020 is quite a useful one. But essentially somebody who has the right training, the right experience, the right knowledge and the right aptitude to be able to fill it in a defensible way. Ultimately, if you end up at inquiry, the inspector will ask you, are you qualified? If you can't reasonably say you're qualified, then you're probably not suitably qualified to be doing that kind of assessment work. So one just to bear in mind in terms of getting that assessment done in the first place. It's important that the consultants you use are engaged with BNG. I'll be honest, not all of them are at the moment, and that's slightly worrying. They need to understand the process, they need to understand habitat management, and they also critically need to understand the commerciality of what they're recommending. If they're recommending that you put in wall-to-wall fantastic habitats, well, that's great for biodiversity, but commercially that's a nightmare. And also it might be that the people actually doing the management once you've built your site don't have the skill set at the moment to actually manage that habitat to the appropriate condition and standard. So it does need to be a two-way process. They need to be talking to the landscape architects and yourselves, and everyone needs to work together to find the right solution. In terms of timings, from November, main site metric goes live. Small sites has been delayed until April. But what we do know from DEFRA is that both are still going to go ahead on those timescales. So they are coming, it is just over the hill, and everyone does need to apply themselves to it, really. And final point, in terms of the sorts of habitats that are already on sites you might be looking to do an option or to procure or freehold or whatever it might be, if there are habitats on that site that are what's considered to be irreplaceable habitats, so things like fens, marshes, ancient woodland, lowland, very good condition lowland meadows, they are not compatible with the metric approach because it takes longer than 30 years to recreate them. Therefore, you couldn't recreate that habitat within a metric period. So it's very, very important you think about what's there now and think about that as part of your viability process. When you're procuring a piece of land to develop, it might be that you can't actually develop that from a BNG point of view. And it may be that you then have to enter into a discussion with a local authority to find a bespoke solution, or it might just be that you can't deliver that land. So one to be very much aware of, it is a potential bear trap, and further guidance is coming from naturally DEFRA in the next couple of weeks about irreplaceable habitats, what's included and how you should deal with them. And just as a final place, this is essentially what we're all talking about. This is the metric output. If you have a situation where everything's green, everyone's happy. If you have a situation where everything's red, then you've got a bit of a problem. You need to do a bit more work on it. But ultimately, we're looking for a 10% gain delivered over 30 years to a prescription as dictated by the metric and the BNG statement and the BNG plan that comes as part of the planning process. And with that, I shall come back to Richard.
Thank you very much, Neil. An excellent summary and excellent introduction to the topic. We've also started to have quite a few queries as well coming in, so very pleased to see. Just to let people know who possibly weren't aware, we did ask for queries in advance as well, and I recognise a few of the questions being put into this chat, that ones that have been asked online as well, so semi-prepared for a few of these. But please keep sending them in, and we'll see what we can do about answering them. I think it's probably worth beginning with some of the sort of more general queries that have come through. And in fact, I don't know if the panel can actually see these the questions, but if not, I'll read them to you. A possibly an interesting one to begin with about the actual metric itself, probably for you, Nick. So this is it says it's challenging that some elements of biodiversity improvement don't give any improvement for the metric, e.g. bat and bird boxes. Will this change? I think it's probably we can sort of expand in sort of how the metric came about as well, and why they're excluded in the first place.
Yeah, thanks, Richard, and very happy to. Good morning, everyone. So as Neil said in his just now, the metric is habitat-based, and it uses habitats as a proxy for wider biodiversity. So species-specific measures, bird and bat boxes, as per the example, don't count towards net gain. The reason they don't is that actually you can put these measures into a development, but without the supporting habitats, species will struggle to gain any kind of strong benefit from it. So we very much took the view early on that actually it's the habitat that's really important here, and if you provide that, then to an extent, species will then start to come and adapt. There may be other things that actually locally are kind of would still be encouraging you to put those on your scheme, and they can be and often are really good things to include anyway. So this isn't to say don't do it. It's just from a biodiversity net gain perspective, it doesn't get value. We did consider kind of including species more broadly into the metric, but it gets incredibly complicated very quickly. What are we talking about? We're talking about breeding populations, range, etc., etc. We'll keep it under review, but for now, no, this kind of species aren't included in the metric. It uses habitats as a wider proxy.
And I think worth just mentioning as well that the BNG requirements don't necessarily supersede the local policy requirements. So most local authorities still have a local policy requirement to deliver things like bird bat boxes, insect towers and things like that. So it is still there. It just doesn't necessarily count as it is at the moment towards the BNG score.
And I might just add there that if you've got a local policy which is asking you to do more than 10%, depending on the wording of that policy, it's possible that you might be able to use those species, benefits as somehow as part of your argument as to why you're meeting that larger percentage. It really very much depends on whether the metric is the basis for that calculation as specified in the policy or not.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much. So the next sort of couple of questions I was going to lump together was a bit about sort of transition really and the date of application. So there's one that says, will it apply if an application is submitted before November but determined after? And so it's me fiddling around with these. I think there was a similar one. But there were two questions, so I've lost it already, but there are two essentially about when would it apply and what are the transition arrangements. Penny, do you want to have a start with those?
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everybody. Yes, the legislation is clear that the mandatory BNG rules in the legislation kick in to any application determined after November 2023. So that would mean, according to the legislation as it stands now, that if you had an application now into a planning authority, but it was not determined until after November or after the date in November, whichever we decide is the start date, then it would be subject to mandatory BNG. However, and this is the big however, we are hearing, and I've not seen any official documentation about this, but I certainly heard DEFRA say myself, straight from the horse's mouth, I've heard them say that the plan is to amend that so that it's only applications made after the start date that would be captured by this mandatory BNG system. So we haven't yet seen the sort of legal details as to how that change is going to be affected, but I'm pretty sure, based on what I'm hearing, that will happen. And perhaps Nick has something to add there. I don't know.
Just to echo, this Penny's not making this up. Absolutely, we're hearing exactly the same thing as well. So we are still waiting on the kind of the legal details for how this will kind of be set out. It will be through part of the secondary legislation. But yes, I kind of echo what Penny was saying. The other point I suppose to potentially also make in terms of transition is that, so as Neil said, at the moment we've got version 4 of the metric, that's the currently published version. DEFRA, when they kind of consulted on it and responded to that consultation, said that they expect the statutory metric to be, the Secretary of State's metric to be based on version 4. That statutory metric won't become available until net gain has legally commenced. So we are expecting there to be a kind of transition period as well. So it's likely that there will be a short period of time where it's accepted that if you've got a scheme that's at a particularly advanced state, you could still use version 4. So we are expecting there to be some sort of transition arrangements in place.
I suppose the other thing, just to pick up on that, is that there's a lot of discussion about outline applications or reserved matters. And Penny, I'm sure you'll keep me straight on this one, but as far as I'm aware, if you have outline permission already that's been determined by the local authority pre-November 23, then you don't have the requirement to deliver the 10%. We know a lot of local authorities are trying to impose that already, and we've been quite clear that we don't think that's right. But anything beyond November qualifies. I think pre-November doesn't qualify. And I think I'm right in saying, Penny, that includes reserved matters linked to the existing outlines.
Yes, I think that's right. So I must say that 6 months ago, I was a little bit concerned about this point, but it's become clearer as time's gone on. I think what you said exactly right, Neil. So as you say, outlines granted before November will not be subject to mandatory BNG, and reserved matters granted pursuant to those outline permissions, in other words, the pre-November outline permissions, would not be subject to mandatory BNG, because a reserved matters approval is not a grant of planning permission, which is the wording in the legislation. And that position has been confirmed last Friday in a case that was in the High Court called Fry. It wasn't about BNG, but it's confirmed that a reserved matters application is not a grant of planning permission. And it was actually a case that was heard in relation to habitats regulations assessments. But the point is that that principle has now been firmly established by the court. So I feel confident to say that reserved matters approvals won't be subject to BNG if they're following an outline from before November 2023. If you get an outline after November 2023, you can expect BNG to have been considered, and there will be special consideration given to the fact that it is an outline and there will be phases, and you can expect phasing to BNG to be sort of spread around the phasing of that site. But again, the details will be coming out in secondary legislation.
There is sorry, Nick, go on, you going.
The only thing I was just going to say, Richard, is I'm conscious all three of us keep talking about November 2023, and I'm sure people on the call are potentially wondering, exactly when in November, and none of us currently know. So as soon as we do know, we'll obviously let people, we'll let the wider world know. But at the moment, it is going to commence sometime in November 2023. We're not sure exactly when. I would assume it would be towards the second half of that month, but we wait to hear.
Yeah, I was going to jump in there. There is another question which I know the answer is no, but someone else, do we have any idea when the secondary legislation is going to come in? And I don't think anyone on the panel can.
Not a fixed date at the moment, as far as I'm aware.
No, it's being worked on. Obviously, it needs to come through fairly quickly, but so we should see it fairly soon. But we can't give a specific date, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So Richard,
it's a popular question that came on twice. So sorry, but go on. Yeah.
If I'm just looking at some of the questions coming in, are quite technical in terms of quite specific things about specific types of habitats and things like that. I think as a general point, I would just make it clear to everyone that DEFRA is not in the process of not currently producing a 300-page how-to guide on BNG. That's just not in the pipeline. And there is going to, they will provide some very useful guidance, and we've got an idea of what that will be. There will be guidance for the metric and things like that, but there is also going to be a certain degree of consultant ecologists, particularly taking what we have got and applying their professional judgment to specific things about quantums of habitats that require mapping, what's the minimum threshold, things like that, specifics about certain habitat types and condition. It does need to be an iterative process, and it does need people with expertise in ecology to actually put together reasonable proportionate arguments in the way that it always has been. We're not going to get that ticky box how to very, very definite guide from DEFRA. So there was a structure, that there's a principles in place, and there is some information, but it's up to us really as a development community to put together things that we think are reasonable, that are in the spirit of what BNG is supposed to be about, and ultimately are defensible from the local authorities' point of view.
And just to add to Neil's point, particularly for any ecologists or equally landscape architects, it's on the call. There are existing training courses out there as well. SAIM run quite a range of them, and as do others. So I would encourage people to access those as well. And also, we as Natural England have started to, you may have seen, we kind of updated some of our case studies this week in relation to Metric 4. Our intention is to continue to produce those over time. And so if people listening to this feel that actually they would welcome a case study around a particular development type of scenario, that they feel it would be useful not just for themselves but for others, please do let us know, and we can look at potentially including those into that forward programme of case studies as well.
What's the best way of letting you know? Is there an obvious way of being in touch with Natural England?
Yeah, I mean, the easiest way is through using the Metric mailbox that you kindly plugged earlier, Richard, as well. So, yeah, if you have a suggestion, I mean, feel free to contact me direct, but probably better to use the Metric mailbox. Okay.
Thanks for the sort of word of warning, Neil. I think so. So we're saying possibly some of the answers to some of these questions is read the guidance, which. So, but I'm sort of trying to pick up some of the more general points as well, I think. And then, but obviously, if the answer is read the guidance, jump in there. There's one. It's about the areas of special, suitable alternative natural green space as well. I wonder if that falls in. So, but this might work. So, if there's a planning application to develop a SANG, would this need to provide the 10% biodiversity net gain? Neil, what's your view?
This is quite a live topic at the moment, and what we're seeing, I mean, I should just point out that in terms of my remit for Bellway, I sit across all of our 22 divisions, so I get quite a good cross-section of what's going on from a local perspective from lots of local authorities. Some local authority, because it's not clearly defined from DEFRA at the moment in terms of whether a SANG can count towards the 10%, a lot of local authorities are sort of taking the lead in self-policing. And some are saying, no, absolutely not. A SANG is a very specific thing for a very specific purpose. Others are being a bit more pragmatic about it, understanding that land is at a premium, it costs a lot of money, and it does need to be multifunctional. So I think there is a very real point in there about recreation and habitat creation. And I think there always has to be a certain degree of common sense applied to it, that if you've got a residential scheme which is going to result in an extra 1,000 people, and you've got some green space, well, that green space in reality is going to be used for dog walking, kicking a football about, chucking frisbees and all the rest of it. It can't therefore deliver good or very good quality habitat because it's compromised by the recreational need. So I think there's always an argument in there to put forward to the local authority that's reasonable, proportionate. But I think ultimately you might have to wait for DEFRA to come back to us on that one in terms of clearly defining what their view is, and we can take that as the baseline and work from there.
Happy to, I mean, Penny, you may want to jump in on this as well, but I'm kind of happy just to also say that it's Natural England's view and our understanding of DEFRA's view as well is that, yes, you can use it, but very much in line with what Neil's just said. So it can contribute towards your net gain. The SANG itself could never get you beyond a position of no net loss. You'd have to be able to evidence that what you'd done had been over and above the kind of minimum requirements for the SANG itself, but then also bearing in mind Neil's point that the SANG is there for a particular purpose, which is around its amenity, kind of recreational, avoiding kind of disturbance elsewhere, and so whatever you do wouldn't be able to, you couldn't deliver something that would jeopardize that as well. So it does constrain kind of the ability to the SANG to deliver certain outcomes. But in principle, yes, it can be used.
Yeah, and I think that reading the guidance that's been coming out over the last 18 months, it's clear the government, DEFRA, does want to see land being used where possible for multiple regime requirements, if you see what I mean. There's no suggestion that we can only use one piece of land for one thing and then have to find another piece of land for something else. That doesn't seem to be the way it's gone, which is welcome news for developers. And as Nick says, I think the thing to remember is that when you're thinking about legal regimes to offset impacts on European sites, or in fact, European protected species, what the legal requirement there is, it's to negate your impact. It's to ensure that the favourable conservation status continues, which means effectively it's a status quo requirement, whereas BNG is a 10% uplift. And that's, I think, at the root of what Nick's just said, and I would agree with that, that if you're going to produce some kind of mitigation or compensation to address a protected species or a protected site, then that is designed to meet to get to a neutral position. But the 10% BNG is an additional requirement. That's, I think, that the root of why we can only say that you can contribute, use those offsetting measures to contribute to BNG, but not to wholly deliver it.
Yeah, I think additionality is the word that a lot of people are increasingly using. And that there is a very good report that was produced, I think, in February on nature markets.
Yes, exactly. That's a really good report.
Yeah, it really gets the nub of what you can not stack. So I think we can probably put that in, maybe make it accessible to everyone, Richard.
That's right. Who published the report?
It was a government report, nature-based markets, Okay. And I just also, maybe Nick can confirm this, I think additionality is what you talk about when you're talking about developers and their own sites where they're developing land, but I think stacking is what you talk about for landowners. I've only just really got to grips with that, but that is the different terminology, just in case you want to know.
Oh, you're muted, Nick.
Kind of broadly correct, yes, Penny. The other thing as well, so there is the report that Neil and Penny mentioned that came out earlier in the year. There is also some shorter guidance on gov.uk now. There's a collections page for BNG on gov.uk, and there is some guidance that was published on stacking and additionality there. The one thing I would say to people is with anything that goes on gov.uk, it's doesn't always answer everything that people would like to, and there are some restrictions around what can go there in the first place. But government is always quite open to trying to update it over time as well. So it is worth keep kind of coming back to it, because you may find that it's actually been subsequently updated from when you last looked at it as well. And that is the case for the additionality. There have been some kind of tweaks to the wording to try and make it slightly clearer on there.
Brilliant. Okay, thanks very much all. Move to the next one, which I think hopefully straightforward enough. So someone's asked, if over 10% net gain can be achieved, can any additional credits be sold to other schemes? Penny, do you want to start off with that?
Yeah, I think they can. Yes. Obviously, you've got to be satisfied that you're going to get your planning permission based on the 10%, because if the policy says 20, you might have to give some more over anyway. But assuming you can get your planning permission based on 10%, and then you deliver 10% to discharge the condition, if you've got extra, I think you can potentially sell those. But what you've got to realise is you're then, to the extent that you have got spare units to sell, you're then regarded as an off-site provider, because you'll be providing units as just like a farmer might for another developer. So what that means is, in order to be able to sell those units, you've got to have, first of all, a legal agreement securing the delivery of those units and the management of them for 30 years. And then you've got to register that with Natural England as off-site units, this is the procedure that any farmer or landowner who wants to create units and sell them to developers must pursue under the Act. So you'd probably need a slightly complex Section 106 that would distinguish between units that are on your red line and units that you're going to sell. But I think it's doable. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's also quite a very important distinction to be made there, Richard, in terms of what is a unit and what is a credit.
Yeah.
Credits are not units. They are distinctly different. Credits are sold by the government as a last resort if you can't secure your units elsewhere. So the output from the metric is measured in units, and anything bought on the open market to allow you to get to your 10% is a unit. It's not a credit, and it's really, really important that everyone uses the right terminology in that respect, because They come from different parts of the legislation, they have different functions, and they have different costs as well. We're still waiting on the confirmation of what statutory credit costs will be, but the idea of the statutory credits is they essentially create the glass ceiling for the open market. So they will be the upper cost, and that's almost the benchmarking you can use to price your own units if you're looking to sell them yourselves. We've looked at this quite a lot from Bellway's point of view, particularly in relation to phasing and the ability to release units. There's two things from a developer's point of view. Firstly, as I said before, it's a minimum of 10%. So if you find that you're not delivering your 10%, actually it might be quite useful to have a few units spare in your back pocket to give you a little bit of wriggle room before just selling them off. And equally, you have to clearly define those extra units as part of your plan. You can't just lump them all together as part of a wider landscaping scheme and say, I've got 10 extra units. That's not the way it works. So they have to be clearly defined, they have to be registered, as Penny mentioned, and you also have to think about who's going to pay for the management. If you're providing extra units and you're expecting somebody to pay for them as part of their service charge through the management company, well, that's not really realistic to expect someone from one development to pay for units for another. So you also have to think quite carefully about how you're pricing them, how that's worked out through your viabilities, and ultimately who's going to be doing the management and who's paying for that management. So it is, yes, it is absolutely possible, but it's also quite complicated from a developer's point of view to realise there's excess units on the same site.
Okay. Very good point. Thank you, Neil. And also particularly aware that we're moving away from the core topic of the metric, I think, as to discuss off-site and on-site, which we suspected might be the case. We have got two other clinics sort of lined up. In fact, they weren't booked in over the summer, but in fact, recognising most people are on holiday over August, we'll probably push them into sort of September. But these are going to be on-site and off-site as well. So we'll have similar sessions on those as well. Although that said, I'm slightly in danger of repeating myself here. Adele, who sent in lots of queries, a lot of them are quite technical on sort of ecology queries, so might not get to all of those. But I think following on, you did have a slide about trading on your presentation, Neil. And so Adele says, could you quickly explain how trading will work, i.e. who will be in charge, monitoring requirements, remedial actions, etc.?
Okay, so there's a distinction here. So trading rules are different to trading units.
Okay.
So in one respect, we're talking about how you complete the metric and the principles of the metric. On the other hand, we're talking about an open market where one can trade units with other people. So enshrined within the metric process are the 6 trading rules. And ultimately, unless you satisfy those 6 trading rules, you can't produce a balanced metric. You can't produce your 10%. There is scope within that for things to not quite be right, and therefore you have that discussion with the local authority. But as a general principle, you need to satisfy those trading rules. In terms of trading, as in open market, financial, commercial trading of units, the registration process will be administered by Natural England. Local authorities will have a key role in understanding what's available locally, but as far as we're aware at the moment, there won't be one centralised body whose role it is to administer the unit process. It will be left up to private individuals, private companies to have private arrangements with different people who need. The Future Homes Hub is in the process of producing an online resource so that if folks are looking to sell excess units, they can register those units on that resource. It's different to registering with Natural England, I should point out. It's literally just a signposting process, so that if you need units, you can go onto the Future Homes Hub website, you can look at what's available in your local area, what sort of units are available in your local area, because that's quite important as well, and you can be put in touch with those unit providers and do your transactions that way. But just to be clear, there is a distinct difference between trading rules and trading units.
Nick, did you have something to add here?
I was just going to mention it, and perhaps also sort of bring this slightly back onto the metric as well. So the kind of, when you are going off-site or you're looking to go off-site, but you can't achieve your net gain on-site, then the potential kind of people you might be contracting with, as Neil described, they'll be using exactly the same metric as you to kind of calculate what it is, what's the baseline value of their existing land, and they could be a farmer, an NGO, local planning authority. It could be your own land if you've got a land bank that you're not looking to develop, and then again using the metric to calculate what the forecast uplift is. The one thing I wanted to mention, though, is that there is, in terms of the way the metric works, and also kind of which is supported a kind of wider policy, an ambition to try and keep your off-site delivery relatively close to where the development impact occurs. It doesn't have to be, but if you end up contracting with someone that's a long distance from yourselves, and typically there are some variations, but typically that would be outside your local planning authority area or the wider natural character area, then there are some multipliers that begin to kick in, which have the effect of that landowner's land is worth less biodiversity units than would be the case if they were closer to you as well. So it is also worth bearing that in mind when thinking about where do you want to go and deliver. And it's to try and disincentivize a situation whereby, for example, developments in London, all the gains were being delivered in Carlisle, which doesn't, or Cumbria rather, which doesn't necessarily help the ecology of London or the citizens of London, as an extreme example.
Yeah, I mean, we've actually done a little bit of work on that, which I'm happy to share with folks now, is that if you take a scenario whereby Bellway are looking to develop a site in Northumberland, and for argument's sake, we needed about 10 hectares of land off-site to get to our 10%. From that 10 hectares of land, if we have arable land that we turn into decent quality other neutral grassland, we can release about 46 biodiversity units by changing the management if it's in Northumberland as well. If that land is across the border in Newcastle, then the number of units we can release through that same process drops to about 30 because it goes cross-border, and therefore the multipliers reduce in the metric. If that land is in a local authority area which doesn't share any boundary with the host local authority, i.e. Northumberland, the number of units you can release drops down to about 15 because of the way the multipliers are structured. So there really is an incentive to try and do it within the same host local authority or the same natural character area. That's the other thing to bear in mind. But if you go cross-border, you can still deliver, but the bang for your buck you get reduces quite substantially. So that's one just to bear in mind in terms of, even if you're buying units from another provider, those units still talk to the metric for your individual site. So that just one to really bear in mind with that.
That's an interesting point, Neil, about sort of sharing that sort of sensitivity analysis, if you like. Is there any thoughts about how we can do that better? Is it about sharing case studies potentially, or any other thoughts?
The way I would look at it at the moment is there's a lot of information out there, and it does take quite a lot of time to churn through, but there is a lot of information out there for a reason. And if you're minded to do so, you can find the answers to the questions you have quite quickly. I think things like the Future Homes Hub, like Natural England's website, the .gov website, are very, very useful, and they're good at signposting. And I think certainly from the Hub's point of view, we're quite keen to use that as a repository for really, really useful information. So if I find a report that I think is particularly useful, I can pass it on and they'll upload that onto their website for everyone to share. But unfortunately, BNG is not intuitive in the way that a lot of people think it is. It is fundamentally different to the way in which ecology has been done up to this point. So you do need to invest a bit of time just really reading the guidance, particularly understanding how it works, to make sure that you're on message and you are fully up to speed to be able to deliver from a development point of view, from an ecological consultant point of view, from a landscape architect point of view. Everyone has a really fundamental role to play in this process. You do need to understand what your role is and how the guidance interrelates with your role as well.
Thank you, Neil. I think this is a question almost as answered by the first question we had about bat boxes, but there's if you're creating habitat for protected species mitigation, can you count that for BNG as well, Nick?
So it links very much to the conversation we had around SANGs, and so yes, in theory you can, it can count towards it, but it gets capped up to a point equivalent to no net loss, which is to Penny's point around that's what the purpose of that was. So you could still do things beyond that on that site if that was possible, and take it further. But the actual mitigation measures can count towards your net gain, but they can't get beyond no net loss in and of themselves.
Perfect. Thank you. One question just jumped in now. Joe Heath has just jumped the queue, only because I was expecting to hear someone ask a question about suitably qualified people. So he's just asked, there's a requirement for a suitably qualified person to populate the metric. Is there a similar requirement for organisations that manage on-site / off-site BNG to be suitably qualified? If not, should there be? I think there's almost two questions there. Can we just explore a little bit more about the suitably qualified person, first of all, about the metric, and then maybe move to the other one, or maybe even part that for our future clinic. But Penny, do you want to come in on that first one about what?
I think as I read this question, I was reminded, I think the Act in section 100, which is one of the key sections, does say that the person who has to manage offsite BNG does have to be competent. So I think it says that, but it's not defined. And obviously we know from the metric user guide that if you're using the metric version 4, that you do need to be competent. But I think we said earlier, it's not entirely clear what that means, although the BS that was mentioned in Neil's opening presentation has got some useful information. I mean, it's really just thinking, is the person you're leaving this job with an ecologist? Are they qualified as an ecologist? I think really is what you've got to ask. And, you know, if you're a developer looking to recruit an ecologist to help you, the question isn't, can you do a BAT survey now? It's, do you understand the metric, and do you understand what mandatory biodiversity net gain is? You know, those are the questions, and demonstrate that you do, because it's not going to be so much about, it's going to be ecologists who really understand how to identify habitats, give the appropriate condition assessment. It's not really about, you know, for BNG anyway, the traditional skills of bat surveys and bird surveys. But I'm sure Neil would have lots more to say about this, so I'll stop.
Yeah, I mean, just as an example, we at Bellway have literally this week just launched our approved BNG contractors process. And the aim of that is to make sure that the people we are using, particularly from ecological consultant point of view, are able to deliver what we need to deliver. And I think the way I would view it in terms of suitably qualified person would be, if someone's being cross-examined, are they able to robustly demonstrate that they do have the appropriate skill set? Because ultimately this is all about planning, and it's ultimately that every planning application could in theory end up at appeal. So you need to make sure that the folks doing this assessment can sit in front of a planning inspector and reasonably argue that they are qualified to do what it is you're asking them to do. I think the other point in terms of the management companies is a really important point. And I think for the developers among you, it's one to consider that if you are looking for your mancos to do the management of your habitats within your sites, with the greatest respect to the mancos, they're often people who do very functional habitat management. They drive a tractor, they mow the amenity grass, and they cut the hedges once a year and things like that. That's not what BNG is about. And it's a much more specific skill set required to deliver a habitat to a known condition, which is quite a strict condition in terms of how you achieve it. So there's a question to ask about the habitats that you're speccing for your landscape schemes. Are you actually delivering something that is deliverable? But also, are the folks doing that management able to do that at the moment, or do they actually need to upskill as well? I think ultimately a register of approved BNG management contractors is a definite thing we need to look at, and I think it will evolve at some stage. It's not there at the moment, although we are having conversations through functions like the Future Homes Hub to look at how that would work, how would people apply, how would people demonstrate their skill sets, and ultimately where would that information be housed. Yes, top question, and I think that's absolutely something that everyone should be thinking about.
And just to add to that, so yeah, ask questions. Just to throw another standard out there is a British standard for designing and implementing biodiversity net gain as well, which is BS 8683. So that's worth people asking questions. Is this a standard that you can deliver against? And also just on the point around ecology, as I mentioned, there's lots of kind of BNG training courses now that are being run by ecologists. The fact that someone is an ecologist doesn't necessarily mean they know much about BNG. They may be an expert at great crested newts, for example, but know nothing about BNG. So again, ask questions. Have they attended BNG related training? And there's lots that's being run by various professional and other bodies now as well.
Yeah, I absolutely echo that, and we're seeing a lot of quite well established ecological consultants not engaging with BNG in the way they need to. It's not JNCC phase 1 habitat methodology anymore. It's changed. It's UK HAB. The way in which you need to record your habitats is different. It's matrices. You need to follow the condition matrices to be able to populate the metrics. So it is a fundamentally different way of looking at habitats. And
Neil,
there is a requirement to embrace that and make sure that you're doing what
you
you're
hung
trying
just
to do.
at the end, but I think we got the gist. But thanks, Neil. I've got a question which, well, it's only because it's come up, I think, 3 times talking about irreplaceable habitats. I do hear that question a little bit. So one particular one, which was, will cultural landscape / design landscape habitats, i.e. wood, pasture and parkland BAP, be part of the irreplaceable habitats? But I think there's other more general questions, which is what will be on the list of irreplaceable habitats. Any views?
So
Nick?
we don't know at the moment. So at the moment, there's the MPPF, which has a definition around irreplaceability and gives examples of habitats that could be regarded as being irreplaceable. As has been said, there is intended to be a kind of updated kind of definition of irreplaceability and a list of irreplaceable habitats for BNG, but that's not been published. We don't have the SI around that, so we're waiting to see what comes out.
I was hoping there was one particular query about which I was hoping a bit of a case study, which I quite like the idea of, but I don't think we're going to have time to get to look at that this time, although it might be used for sort of case study we can use for future clinics. Look, we've got 4 minutes to go really before the end of the webinar, and I thought I'd probably bring the questions to a close and just ask the panel really, are there any topics that you thought we might be discussing or any additional points you'd like to make about the BNG metric that we haven't really talked about yet already? Neil, can I start with you?
I think my takeaway from this is that we do need to approach BNG with positivity. It is coming, it is going to affect the way we do all development going forward, so therefore we do need to embrace it. It's not going away, it's been confirmed. And I think that therefore we really do need to use the metric as a tool, and it's a way in which we design our schemes. It is ultimately a statutory function, we need to adhere to that, but ultimately it's also an opportunity for us all to think about the way we design our landscaping, design our habitats, and ultimately make a better place for the communities that buy our homes as well. So it's a really important step. It does need a lot of thought, but actually it's not limiting necessarily in the way in which we do our business. It is an opportunity to do something different, but actually ultimately better.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Neil. Penny, any thoughts?
I was just thinking it would be useful just to touch on the extent to which the metric can be departed from. And basically the answer is you can't really, except that there is in the user guide an opportunity to make a specific case to a local planning authority if you have really good reasons, but it is meant to be exceptional reasons. So I guess basically you do need to follow the metric, but it's clear from the user guide that if there is a specific case that means you think for some reason it's warranted to depart from it, you can make that case to the local planning authority. It is going to be exceptional, but I think it's just important to be aware of that. And if you were needing to do that, you would need to look at the user guide and look at the language used just to make sure you can make your case on that basis. I just felt that was something we ought to add to the session this morning.
Yeah, thank you very much. Actually, Penny, can we also take this opportunity to plug some of the training that you've been putting together as well? You've been some really good webinars as well that Freeths has held. How do we find them?
Well, I've just there are a couple of YouTube webinars that we have published and they're freely available. And I know that Future Homes Hub has the links. I have them here as well, but I can't seem to get them quickly added to the chat now.
Put them in the chat if we can do now, and if not, we'll find a way of promoting it then.
But we do also offer more detailed training courses where we sell tickets basically, and we're doing that. And so please get in touch if you would like training. We do offer courses and the tickets are available to buy. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you, Penny. And so I suppose, Nick, final word to you. You've been living and breathing this for an awful long time. What have we not talked about
I just kind of want to reinforce slightly what Neil was saying, but take it slightly further. Neil talks about the metric as being a tool, and I'd really want to stress that point. And the earlier you can begin to use it at kind of site selection, outline design stage, you can use it with indicative information. You don't need to be an ecologist to do that. I'm not an ecologist. I can use the metric in that way. It's relatively straightforward and simple to do. And it can, and use it to engage with others as part of the project as well, to kind of co-design something that is sensible, can deliver kind of potentially gains on site, or if that's not appropriate, look at going off site as well. So is that using it as part of a kind of wider kind of design for your scheme, and kind of run different scenarios through it. It can do that, and as I said, it doesn't necessarily need kind of detailed kind of ecology kind of ground truth information at that stage. That needs to come in at some point, but you can kind of just do it as a desk-based, so I can't speak, desk-based exercise as well. And the final thing would be to say that actually, for me, what's fantastic about it is that for the first time, everything on a site has a value in terms of it for nature, which is a real change in terms of how we've considered the environment and developments in the past.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Nick, and thank you to our panel as well. It's been brilliant having your insight. Thanks also for those online who've sent your questions. As I said, we'll collate them because it's really useful information about what is needed and how we can help to answer some of these queries generally as a sector. So thank you very much. We will keep your eye on our website. We'll be promoting future clinics in the future, in I think early September. But any feedback you got from today or anything else, please get in touch, admin@futurehomes.org.uk. And I'll bring that to a close. Thanks very much all. Okay.